Hey everyone. It seems to me, at least, that recently when I've been looking up how to study vocabulary in Japanese, repeatedly reading vocabulary books has become pretty popular. This method promises that you can learn vocabulary just by reading and rereading vocabulary books. Actually, according to one study done at a Chinese university in 2014, participants were able to learn about 1,800 words, 1,800 words in just 20 days using this method. Even more incredible is that after 2 months, students were tested again on those vocabulary words, and they were able to retain 90% of what they had learned. That's pretty incredible, right? However, with any work that you do, it's not only the results you need to be concerned with, but also the efficiency of what you're doing. That is, how much you get for what you put in. When you take efficiency and not just the overall results into consideration though, is reading vocabulary books over and over really the best method to learn vocabulary? Or is there a better way? Today, we're going to look at not only repeatedly reading vocabulary books, but also studying word lists and flashcards, and see which method comes out on top. First though, in order to decide which strategy is best, we need to establish some criteria as to what constitutes efficiency when it comes to vocabulary study. So in order to judge our 3 methods, I've come up with the next 4 criteria. Number 1, does it work with the 3 guidelines? Number 2, can it use active recall? Number 3, can it use a spaced repetition system? Number 4, time. How much time do preparation and studying actually take up? The 3 guidelines are, number 1, a little at a time. Don't try to do too much at one time. Number 2, variety. Words that you study at the same time should differ in meaning, shape, and pronunciation. And 3, KISS, keep it simple. Keep your study method as simple as possible. These guidelines are designed to increase efficiency in vocabulary study. For more information on the 3 guidelines, be sure to check out the 3 guidelines video. Number 2, can it use active recall? Active recall is a method of reviewing information. Say, for example, you want to review a passage from a textbook that you went over in a class. Simply rereading the passage or your notes is not actually that effective. Because the information is right in front of your eyes, you trick yourself into thinking you know the information when you really don't. Active recall, though, uses a question and answer format to force you to retrieve information from your memory. As an example, let's say you have to remember the following information. You need to break this information down into smaller chunks and make each chunk into a question. Who crossed the Pacific Ocean and started living in Hawaii? In what year was Hawaii discovered? What began after Hawaii was discovered? When using active recall to study vocabulary, normally you read the word you're trying to learn and then try to guess the meaning. But if you want to increase your ability to produce the word when writing or speaking, then you should study by looking at the meaning and trying to guess the word. Number 3, can it use a spaced repetition system? In a spaced repetition system, you don't study at regular intervals, but instead you study at increasingly longer intervals. When you study in this way, there are 2 major benefits. 1, information actually stays in your memory longer, and 2, you spend less time studying than if you were to study at regular intervals. Methods that can use a spaced repetition system will be more efficient. Number 4, time. How much time do preparation and studying actually take up? Even if your method is effective, if it takes up too much time, it's not efficient. So we want to try and find a method that takes as little time as possible. Okay, so now let's take a look at the 3 methods. Word lists. The word list strategy is simply writing the words you want to know and their meaning in a list on some paper and memorizing them in order. You really only need paper and a pen to use this method, so it's probably the most widely used because it's so simple. You can easily control the amount of words that you want to study and what words you study. And the method itself is incredibly simple, the simplest of the 3 we're looking at today, so it is highly compatible with the 3 guidelines. You can also use spaced repetition with word lists. Active recall, though, is not intrinsic to the word list method. However, there are many ways you can use active recall with word lists. However, word lists have a huge drawback known as the list effect. When you study a list of items, in most cases you start from the top of the list and go down to the bottom of the list. That's not really a problem. However, what about the second time you study the list? And the third time? And the fourth time? Chances are, each time you start from the top and go down to the bottom. The result of studying items in a list in order is that you begin to remember the order of the items in the list more than the items themselves. When the things in the list are taken out of that context, it can be hard to remember what they mean. There is one other aspect of the list effect, though. Oftentimes when you study a list, what you remember are the items toward the beginning and the end of the list, while memory of those in the middle is a bit foggy. So word lists are simple and can be effective tools, but they are limited by the list effect phenomenon. Flashcards. Flashcards are essentially word lists that have been split up. On the front of one small piece of paper, you write a word you want to know, and on the back, you write the meaning of that word. These days, there are also lots of different digital flashcard apps that you can get for your smartphone. Flashcards pass the 3 guidelines, but it is very easy to want to put a lot of information on each card and violate KISS, keep it simple. So you have to be very careful. Also, not shuffling your cards can lead to the list effect discussed with word lists. So if you use flashcards, be sure to shuffle regularly. Spaced repetition systems can easily be used with flashcards, and active recall is an essential component of flashcard study. You have to use active recall with flashcards. You can also use the alternate active recall method by simply flipping the flashcards around and studying from the meaning side. With flashcards, making the cards themselves tends to take up the most time. However, if you are making sure to keep it simple, KISS, then making the cards shouldn't take up too much of your time either. As a rule of thumb, the amount of time it takes to learn words with flashcards is usually about the same as the number of cards you have. For example, if you have 20 cards, it'll take about 20 minutes to learn those words. Rereading vocabulary books. Rereading vocabulary books is just what it sounds like. You have a book filled with several hundred vocabulary words, their definitions and example sentences, and you read through the book as many times as possible. There are a few different variations on this method, but the thing they all have in common is that each involves repeated readings of a vocabulary book. Let's look at the 3 guidelines. When you think about how many words can be in a typical vocabulary book, there's no way you can keep a little at a time. As for variety, it would appear that the list effect would be an even greater danger than with word lists, based on the number of words in each book. Last, each entry in a vocabulary book has more than just the basic definition for the word listed. And while there are people who say you should just ignore it and just read, the ability to keep it simple is questionable. Whether or not active recall can be used is in part dependent upon the publisher. Some publishers print the words or word meanings in red so you can cover them with a red film sheet, but going from the meaning and guessing the vocabulary is a little harder to pull off. You can, however, get a special set of markers from the 100 yen store and use those to hide the vocabulary words, and then do active recall that way. Vocabulary books do not lend themselves well to spaced repetition systems, as it's simply too difficult to keep track of when you saw what word last. However, you can keep track of when you last read a section or the book as a whole. And then there's time. Obviously, you don't have to spend any time making the vocabulary book. The time spent studying will depend on the number of words in the book and how many times you read it. Just how long does it take to read through one time? What is often recommended is that you should spend 1 minute per entry. If you read at that speed, with a vocabulary book containing 1,200 words, that's already 1,200 minutes, 1,200 minutes, or 20 hours. And that's just one time through when you haven't even memorized anything. As you read and reread, the amount of time it takes you to get through the book will probably decrease, but according to language acquisition research, you need at least 15 meaningful exposures to a word in order to remember it. When you consider that, reading and rereading vocabulary books takes up a lot of time. So let's compare the three methods. As you can see, based on our criteria, flashcards win out over wordless and rereading vocabulary books. Flashcards have a high rate of compatibility with the three guidelines. You can use active recall and spaced repetition with them, and they don't take up that much time to use. After flashcards are wordless. There are two reasons wordless lose out to flashcards. The first reason is the list effect phenomenon. The second reason is that with flashcards, you have no choice but to use active recall. But with wordless, this is not the case. In fact, some research in measuring the effectiveness of wordless indicates that many people do not use active recall when studying with wordless. However, when you do begin to use active recall with wordless, the gap between wordless and flashcards decreases. And in last place is rereading vocabulary books. This method doesn't do too well under these criteria. But that doesn't mean that rereading vocabulary books is not effective. It is effective, but the cost of that effectiveness is very great. Too great. In fact, let's look at rereading vocabulary books a little bit more in depth. Let's take a more careful look at the research I mentioned at the beginning of the video. University students who participated in the study all used the same study method for 20 days. The method they used not only involved reading and rereading, but also a little writing and rewriting. So this may not necessarily be the same as what you think rereading vocabulary books should be. The result of the 20 days that they studied was that the test participants learned around 1,800 vocabulary words, which works out to be about 90 words per day on average. Pretty impressive, right? Unfortunately though, there are two big drawbacks to this research. The first is how much time was actually spent on studying. In the 20 days of study, the participants studied for 8 hours every single day. So even if their average daily acquisition was 90 words, the hourly average was around 11 words. It wasn't that the test participants acquired 1,800 words over the course of 20 days going about their regular lives either. Instead, they did it by focusing on nothing but studying the words, the vocabulary. The only other thing they did was eat and drink. The second drawback is the ratio of words studied to words learned. The participants were able to acquire 1,800 items of vocabulary. Yes, but how many words were actually in the vocabulary book used in the experiment? It wasn't 1,800. It wasn't 2,000. It wasn't 3,000. It was right around 6,700 words. That means that participants acquired 1,800 vocabulary words, yes, but because they studied a book of 6,700 words, they only really acquired 26% of the words they studied. Now, some people might think that, well, they learned 1,800 words, that's good enough, right? It's good, yeah, but it really points to a more disturbing truth. The fact that even though they studied around 6,700 words and only acquired 1,800 words it shows that the learners were not in control of their own study. It was just a shotgun approach. That's a lot of time and energy wasted, and it kind of makes me upset. If I'm going to take the time to study something, I really want to learn it. Don't you? But it's not enough to just say that the acquisition rate for reading and rereading vocabulary books is pretty poor. We have to show that other methods are better than that. Now, I don't have access to any research that is close to the Chinese study that uses flashcards, but there have been many studies, numerous studies, over the years that measure the effectiveness of using flashcards to learn vocabulary. When using flashcards correctly, the acquisition rate is generally around 85%, whether using digital or paper-based flashcards. So let's do a little numbers experiment. Let's say we want to learn 1,800 words in the same 20-day period as the Chinese study. The way to go about it wouldn't be to study for 8 hours a day every day for 20 days, no. Instead, we would set up 8 periods of study for each day. So for example, you'd study a little at 9, then a little more at 10, and so on. At each study session, you would commit 14 words to memory. As stated before, the amount of words you study is generally how many minutes it will take to learn the words. So 14 words should take around 14 minutes. Review goes faster than learning, and a conservative estimate is 10 cards per minute. The amount you review each time will vary, but generally speaking, it will be about 4 to 5 times the number of cards you learn at each session. So about 70 cards. At 10 cards per minute, it will take about 7 minutes to review words at each study session. Add that to the 14 minutes it'll take to learn new words, and you have about 21 minutes, give or take, for studying. We'll do this 8 times a day, which gives us 168 minutes or 2 hours and 48 minutes. So let's round that off to 3 hours. If we study like this for 20 days, that's 60 hours total to learn and review words, 100 hours less than the method in the study. And the amount of words we've studied is 2,240 words. Assuming an acquisition rate of 85%, we theoretically could learn 1,904 words. In other words, with considerably less effort, we would be able to gain more vocabulary. Work smarter, not harder. To be honest though, I don't really think it's a good idea to try and learn so much vocabulary in such a short span of time. However, if you are going to do it, then do it in a way that doesn't waste your time. In other words, don't just read and reread a vocabulary book. Make some flashcards. My point is this: vocabulary acquisition is too important to your language development to go about it haphazardly. If you really want to learn a lot of vocabulary in a short amount of time, then use a method that gets results and gets results fast. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.